Well, welcome back to the Decarb Connect podcast. We've had a little bit of a hiatus while we were in planning phase for our upcoming event, but I'm really pleased to be back in it and very pleased to be joined by another disruptor tech, because as people that listen to this know, that's often the stories that I get really excited about. So very pleased today to be joined by Mihir Desu, who's the co-founder of Pressure Corp. And Mihir, you're a development company that transforms industrial waste pressure into clean energy. And I think something that will grab people's attention is that it's a business model that requires zero capital from the host facilities. So we'll get into that a little bit. And the other thing that I'll provide as context before having you give a bit of an introduction to you is that what interests me is that you're one of a growing number of these energy and climate tech disruptors that are basing themselves in Houston. And you're part of the Greentown Labs community there. So there's my kind of intro. Why don't you give us a bit of flavour for how you've arrived at this point in time, and then we'll crack on into the main questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex, for having me on this podcast. It's really a pleasure, and happy to be joining you at the conference here in Houston. So if folks don't know, it's from the 29th through the 31st, Decarb Connect. Come join us. It's going to be a great time. So yeah, I have been working in the clean energy industry for the past decade, and I love the question of like, how did you get started in the clean energy industry? Kind of before it was sexy or before it was cool. And for me, it was not necessarily like climate change or emissions. It was more of an equity issue. And so when I was in high school, I was working in my dad's lab. So he's an electrical engineering professor and was teaching at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and had gotten a couple of grants to work on researching different materials for solar cells and energy storage. And so I got the chance to be a lab assistant for a summer, just changing fluids and beakers and pressing buttons to measure electricity between electrodes and to understand the efficiency. So essentially a lab jockey, writing down the results of different experiments. And I realized that like I did not want to get into hard research, but something about energy captivated me. And when I had gone to India for a visit, I was with my mom, and we were entering this like pretty expansive like community, gated community in New Delhi. And on the wall that was encapsulating the community from the outside, there was essentially a shanty village on the other side. And what I realized is like there's so much untapped resources to help people to make their lives better. And one of the fundamental aspects of that is energy, right? Like if you look at the economic growth trajectory of the world, right, you have these like inflection points where the slope of GDP grows significantly with the Industrial Revolution, and then the ability to exploit oil and gas. And so when I looked at it, I was like, okay, there's these free resources, solar, that I was working on in the lab that could potentially unlock another inflection point to generate even more wealth and resources for communities that don't currently have access. And so that was really what drew me into wanting to tackle this challenge of working on how do we decarbonize society. And so that, along with like the emissions and climate challenge, was what spurred me into the industry. So after college, I started with a firm called Energy GPS. A couple former Enron traders, shout out to Tim Belden and Jeff Richter, who taught me a lot about power markets and how they operate. And it was my first taste into what development is, project development. How do solar developers, wind developers, developers of natural gas plants, like what do they need to look at from an economics perspective to ensure that they can get the financing necessary to construct and build their projects. It was like a really interesting space to be in, and this is kind of in Portland. So did that for a little while, and then moved to a firm that worked on energy efficiency program evaluation. So it's called the Cadmus Group, and we evaluated the programs and ability for what we call implementers in the energy efficiency space, which are essentially project developers in energy efficiency, how well they achieve their targets for energy savings. And so we would have programs for industrial facilities, but also for small and medium and commercial businesses, as well as residential, where they would install different equipment that should achieve energy savings. And we would then on the back end evaluate whether or not they actually did by looking at the energy consumption data, as well as like what the equipment was rated to save, right? Because there's a whole behavioral aspect to energy, which is so fascinating to me, that you can tell so much about humans' behaviors just by looking at load curves. And so that was like a very interesting perspective of going from the demand side, taking a lens on that, versus like formally being on the supply side and having that perspective. And so I moved from there to electrical utility in Portland, Portland General Electric, where I was responsible for the program scope around distributed energy resources. So a lot of those programs are net metering solar or value of solar, energy storage, EV programs, demand response, pricing, all of those. Like, how do we get those approved and passed by the regulators and the stakeholders involved in that process? So I had a stint on that side of the table, and then I moved to another side of the table where we were helping to stand up the programs. How do you determine the right incentive levels to provide to customers to install like a smart water heater or a smart EV charger, smart thermostat, or even adopt solar or batteries? And then on the back end, like, how do these programs integrate with the utility's long-term resource plan, as well as on the operations side, how do these resources integrate with the broader resource portfolio on a day-to-day basis? Like, when can they be dispatched? How can they be dispatched? Like, what are the different tools that operators need to put these programs into practice?
What we've got there is that kind of familial, kind of personal connection to something that you think is significant and has merit, which is that kind of the equity issue in energy. We then have this kind of electrical engineering experience that you had at a very young age. You then have kind of data, power markets, and this look, I guess, a different perspective of them, what makes people change behavior, and what's driving behavior. So there's a few different inputs. So how does Pressure Corp, where did that step into Pressure Corp happen?
Right after the utility experience, I was a consultant and working with a lot of developers on how they integrate into different markets and basically build projects. And I, just before COVID, happened to leave that firm trying to figure out my next move. And once COVID hit, I realized I didn't want to start a new job remotely, and had been kind of seeing some of my friends starting to work in this space as project developers, and realized like, hey, maybe this is something that I want to do as well. And so one of my friends has started a geothermal development company called Terrapin. His name is Sean Collins. And what he realized is that the same technology that they use for geothermal, it's called organic Rankine cycle, that machine can be used for waste heat recovery to electricity generation. And so he started conducting site visits and realized, hey, there's not just a waste heat stream, there's also a waste pressure stream in a lot of these industrial facilities. So he was like, well, why don't we just apply the same type of business model that he was kind of ideating on for waste heat to waste pressure. And that's kind of how we started working on the concept of Pressure Corp and testing out whether or not there's a market fit for what we could offer. And basically that's zero capital down to industrial facilities for essentially paying them to access their waste pressure resources or their waste energy resources. And we would then, install a project there, handle not just the cost of the equipment, but all of the soft costs, the balance of system costs that go into installing that equipment at the facility, covering insurance for safety risk mitigation, other safety issues, which are huge concerns for industrial facilities, right? Because the risk of a project failure, a small project failure like a waste pressure project, is incredibly asymmetric to what they could lose from downtime of their operations that are unplanned. And so a lot of times equipment providers don't offer any insurance for that, right? Their equipment is probably like a 1-2 year warranty, but the project lifetime is like 15, 20, maybe even longer years. And so what we realized is like this is an opportunity to come in, cover not only the equipment costs, but the soft costs of installation, capitalize that, and then go access cheaper third-party capital from infrastructure investors and basically take away opportunity costs from these industrial facility balance sheets who, could invest their resources into more productive and higher returning investments. So take away that pain point, but also be able to mitigate a lot of the risk of these projects actually performing or interrupting any type of operations.
Okay, so then that's the kinds of sectors that you're seeing this waste product be a particular, I guess, opportunity for you and issue for them. So what are those sectors, and where in their sites are these kind of points of waste pressure often cropping up? Is that easy to point to?
The really interesting thing about waste pressure is it happens in any sort of pipeline, right? And pipelines, I like to use the analogy of just roads, right? We have highways, we have local roads. Same with the pipeline network. You have transmission pipelines, which are kind of like highways. You have distribution pipelines, which are kind of like local roads. So as you move gas from the highways, where the gas is traveling fast, which requires a lot of pressure, high pressure, to the local roads or the local pipes, distribution pipelines, you have to, put the brakes on. And through that process of putting the brakes on to reduce the speed of the gas going into these pipelines, you're depressurizing it. And the depressurization process requires this valve. It's a Joule-Thomson valve, also called, pressure relief valve. And they're scattered across the system whenever there's that point where you're going from the highway to the local road. And these valves essentially lose that energy to the atmosphere, right? They're venting often natural gas and causing fugitive emissions, because these are often like pneumonic gas valves, which require some sort of gas to actually push the valve up or down. And often, because the pipeline is transporting natural gas, they're using natural gas to actuate that process, and it releases fugitive emissions into the atmosphere. So what we do is we install this turbo expander in parallel, and these pipelines or these pressure release valves can be, on the pipeline system itself, so owned by transmission pipeline companies. Some of the larger ones in North America are like Enbridge, Kinder Morgan, Boardwalk. It could also be at the point of entry of the pipeline into an industrial facility. And so most of the industrial facilities that we're targeting are using gas as a feedstock. So whether it is to create ammonia from natural gas or hydrogen or some other type of chemicals for, fertilizer, whatever it may be. So that's another target customer, as well as natural gas power plants. So we still have a lot of natural gas power plants running almost 24/7 to generate baseload electricity. It's one of the cheaper resources that is dispatchable for most of the hours of the day. And so because of the consistent flow, there's often also a pressure drop coming from the transmission pipes to the gas plant. But we also get asked, like, are you just working on natural gas pipelines? And the answer is no. The devices and the power plants that we're installing are agnostic to the type of gas in the pipes. So we're prepped for the hydrogen economy as that starts getting ramped up as well.
Okay, so that's always fun on an audio podcast to try and draw a visual image for listeners. But if we kind of imagine these points of entry into a plant or these points of exchange of pressure where you're kind of taking that waste pressure, if you were kind of trying to visualize for our listeners, like what happens then? So in really simplistic terms, because remember, people listening come from all kinds of backgrounds. So what happens?
Starting a little bit from the beginning, right? So you have high pressure gas coming into this valve. The valve, like your pressure cooker, releases the pressure of the gas to depressurize it and start moving slow. So in our system, what happens is the high pressure gas goes into a large tank. That's the main component of our system. It's called a turbo expander. And the tank, as the gas fills the volume of that tank, it starts to depressurize and also move a turbine through the work created in the depressurization process. And that the movement of the turbine generates electricity, and now the depressurized gas goes through an outlet pipe back into the system that it was supposed to go into in the first place. So we essentially capture the wasted work through the former process and turn it into electricity, whereas otherwise it would be wasted.
And then the actual the power that's being generated, what is that going, I don't know, to the same organization that you're, taking that waste pressure from? Or what's the business model around you have this power that you've generated, where does that go? Who's the off taker?
The off taker can often depend on the situation. So we love when we're working with host customers that can also offtake the power. And oftentimes, the power that we're generating is not high enough. We're talking about like in the small single-digit megawatt scales or below, like high kilowatts, where the host customer can actually take that power and use it on site and displace power that they're buying from the grid. So that's like the ideal situation. In situations where that's not possible, we can also interconnect to the grid where there is a grid tie that is close enough and makes economic sense. That's often a more complicated process because you have to go through an interconnection process with the utility that owns the grid that you're interconnecting to, or the wholesale market that owns or that manages the grid that you're interconnecting to. So something that we try to avoid when possible. And then a third option is there are a lot of, especially remote sites where you might have waste pressure, and capturing that energy and turning into electricity where there's no load to take it would mean that project is not viable. Well, there's our new solutions to that, and there's a lot of companies now that provide distributed data centers, right? Or also we've talked to a company that basically takes in power to have like distributed grow factories for different types of vegetables or even marijuana. And so the data centers and those type of grow factories are often things that we can use as solutions for remote loads where they wouldn't otherwise be present.
Okay, so there's those kind of three ways the model can work, one of which is already in motion, one of which is we're making this work with a collaborator, and the third is probably not for us. And then tell us a bit about this, where's the market opportunity in this to you? Like, I mean, there's obviously, the more you talk, the more I'm like, well, there's millions of points of pressure where this could apply, but what's your sense of the scale of the market opportunity and that you could grab hold of, not the wider, all the possibilities, but of the bit of the market that you can really grab hold of? What is that, the scale of that?
Yeah, so we're focused on the North American market, mostly because power prices have been low here historically, which has made these projects, not worth the IRR they could produce, right? Because we have to get probably to a target below or around 5 cents a kilowatt hour, or $50 a megawatt hour, for a lot of these projects to work. And so what has happened in North America is there's more willingness from infrastructure investors to provide cheaper cost of capital, which is a huge lever in the project financial engineering, because you can, justify producing lower electricity prices and taking lower returns because you have investors willing to take on those lower returns. The reason I mentioned kind of the power prices is basically the market opportunity in North America has been untapped. So in markets like Japan, South Korea, in Europe, where electricity prices are much higher, a lot of these projects have actually been deployed. So we see a market opportunity that we're trying to tackle immediately of like around 3 gigawatts. So that's across North America, and so it's US, Canada, maybe in Mexico. It's not an initial focus for us. And that's 3 gigawatts of a total market, that a lot of it remains inaccessible to us, but of like 64 gigawatts of wasted pressure or wasted energy in the pressure space.
Okay, and then you've already alluded there that the fact that there are other regions where this kind of technology exists, and I know that when you and I were doing our prep call, you talked about the fact that it's not that your technology concept is new, but that previous kind of technology initiatives haven't really worked. Part of that is obviously this market pricing issue that you've talked about, but what's different about? It's partly price, I get, but is there something different in the technology or the approach you're taking that also is going to help this kind of flourish in comparison to previous attempts?
Aside from like the cheaper cost of capital and the market pricing, there's also new incentives, like the investment tax credit in the US. In Canada, there's a bunch of incentive programs like emissions reduction. Alberta is one, but what we're doing that's kind of a unique approach is we're not just selling equipment to a customer, to a host customer. And often it's still the case today where the equipment that a host customer could buy and install themselves often has like a 1-year warranty. And they don't cover any risk that the equipment could cause to interrupt operations at the facility. They also don't have warranties that extend through the life of the equipment. They're not responsible for the installation themselves. They're just selling the equipment. So anything that happens, in a negative way during installation is kind of on the host customer. And so all of these things make it very difficult for a manager of an industrial facility to like put the risk in to install something that has such marginal upside for him as or her as a facility manager, right? Because of that, they don't want to take it on. So our approach is we are not actually providing equipment to a facility, right? We are responsible for the installation, development, and operation of a project, which includes holding the risk of anything that happens to facility operations, holding the risk of installation, and we approach installation in a very risk mitigated fashion. We install in parallel to existing equipment as a fail-safe. We install only during scheduled maintenance, so there is not additional interruption time that is required for our equipment to be installed. And then we handle not only the installation or not only the cost of the equipment itself, but the soft cost, the balance of system costs of like putting the piping in from our system to the pipelines on the facility, building out like the electrical componentry to take the electricity generated from our system to wherever it's being used, whether that's the grid or the host customer. So all of these things that traditional turbo expander manufacturers do not provide is kind of our unique value proposition.
Okay, so it's the whole model. It's not just the technology, but it's also that whole approach to the full project life cycle and risk management as well. So here's a question for you. You mentioned in that intro where you were talking about how you've arrived at this point in time. You said that one of the drivers had been a more of a personal driver in a way, which was about playing a role and being a driver of the kind of equitable energy transition. So I'm kind of curious about how Pressure Corp feeds into that. How does it feed that particular driver?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. So industrial emissions account for almost 30% of global emissions. 51% of energy generated for industrial use is wasted. And so wasted energy accounts for almost like 15% of global emissions. And it's not often realized or understood that most of the economically disadvantaged communities are in close proximity to industrial facilities and take the brunt of the emissions that are generated at those facilities. There was a recent New York Times article that actually measured or had a study on the impact of emissions to communities that are historically redlined in the US, right? And because the real estate values are lower, you often have industrial facilities sited there. You have highways that are sited there that create a lot of these emissions. And so Pressure Corp and other companies that are working on industrial decarbonization, by reducing emissions in these highly industrialized locations, you're actually reducing emissions in these communities as well. And all the positive impacts of reducing emissions, which is like better health outcomes, and better performance in school, but better economic ladders, all of these like result from a lot of that. So that's kind of the connection there.
Okay, well, you'd already mentioned a bit earlier on about who your core audience is, which is this kind of group that extends from gas pipeline operators through to gas to X producers and manufacturers, or the power generators. So when you're talking to companies like that or organizations like that, what about this do you find is like the trigger point? What is it that makes them go, oh, we're up for it? I mean, there's a lot of compelling stuff that you talked about around technology, but there are also, as you know, a lot of disruptors offering a lot of projects to a lot of companies. So what is it that tends to grab someone about this?
Times have changed where emissions reductions are not just something that is being required from a regulatory perspective or a policy perspective, but it's really a problem that individuals within these companies want to see changed. And so we're not offering a panacea of a solution, right? Like the projects that we're installing, are relatively small on a scale basis, around like single digit megawatts, like 2 to 5, sometimes even less in unique situations, sometimes more. But the fact that we could go to a pipeline company and help them with the solution to maybe 1,000 of their pressure release valves, and say, look at that data and say, okay, there's like 10 to 20 opportunities that maybe we could actually move forward on, and basically create a decarbonization strategy specifically for waste pressure. I think that is what is engaging folks. In addition, it's like the ESG story, right? It means a lot, not just on a personal perspective of the folks that we're interacting with, but also leadership of these companies, and most importantly, it's making a big impact to shareholders. I'll give an example of another member company in Greentown. Shout out to Sean and Danny at Criterion. They recently closed a seed round of financing, and one of their investors is a publicly traded oil field services company called Patterson UTI. And their investment into Criterion, when it was announced, raised their market cap by like 67 million. So it's not just like an ESG story from like a feel-good perspective, but it has real upside in the capital markets.
Okay, and then actually we'll jump on that, because you mentioned Criterion and the stage that they've just gone through in their journey and their growth. Where are you guys at? What stage are you at in terms of phases of development and your own financing?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So we have been bootstrapping the company to date, and we, are increasing our pipeline of projects and want to have, a solid pipeline of projects that are, on the pathway towards financing before we raise our seed round. So we are planning to do that in May.
And so what sort of project mix are you expecting to be able to announce at that point? Is there, I mean, I know you may not want to mention names of organizations, but what types of installations are going to be part of that platform, do you think?
Yeah, so we're talking to like municipal natural gas utilities, so kind of on the distribution side of things. Also transmission gas utilities, so some of the larger pipeline companies. So installing projects there, as well as like a few power plants. So on potentially university campuses that might be interested as well.
And can you talk at all about the kind of scale of that seed round? What are you aiming for from that?
So we're working on developing our hiring plan and understanding, how much capital we need for that. And we're in a unique spot where, there's a few different types of capital that we can access. And so optimizing how much we want from each stack is kind of what we're working on right now. And I'll dig into that a little bit because I think some folks might find it interesting. So in project development, you have like three capital sources, right? There's corporate capital for your company itself to pay for G&A of employees and other travel type expenses. And then we often talk about project finance, right? So there's different types of project finance. There's finance that comes in when a project is ready for construction. There's finance that comes in when a project is operational to actually buy the project. And then there's finance before a project is construction ready, which is kind of where we do most of our work. It's called the development phase. And so development capital is another area where we can access financing. And so kind of the reason I'm not giving you a specific answer is we're still trying to figure out, are there sources of development capital that can offset the need for, going out to market for more venture capital for our business itself?
Well, my bet is that somewhere in the audience that we have, there are people that go, yes, and I can tell you about them. So if that's you and you're listening, have a look in the show notes because we will include contact information and some links to Mihir and his co-founder's company. And of course, you can always contact me as well. But actually, that last comment you're making about development capital kind of then points into another question that I had for you. I know that you describe yourself as a development company, but what does that mean? In this landscape of all kinds of startups focusing on all kinds of things, what does it mean to be a development company?
There's a little bit of misperception in the space or misunderstanding of what a development company is. Oftentimes when you mention, oh yeah, we're working on a development company, people are like, what, you're a software development company? So I think there needs to be a little bit more awareness of what project development companies do and what they are. So essentially, we are the ones that work on taking a technology and actually deploying it into market, into a project, right? And so it's not as simple as like a widget that you can just sell to a business or consumer where there's no regulatory requirements that you have to satisfy. There's no permitting requirements that you have to satisfy. There's no interconnection requirements. You don't have to find someone to buy electricity, right? The commodity that we're actually selling as a project developer is, either electricity or hydrogen or carbon offsets. It's not the project itself, right? It's not the equipment itself. And so what we do as a project developer is kind of take all those puzzle pieces and put them together in a way that makes sense for all the stakeholders involved. So that includes the host customer, that includes, any regulatory agencies, any utilities or wholesale markets, as well as like the financiers. And there's different types of financiers that I mentioned before. And I think there's a misperception that there's not a lot of technology that project developers have within their company, because depending on what market you're in, if you're a project developer that is getting first to market and you have some of the first deployments in the space, you're developing a lot of know-how and understanding, and you're capturing a lot of data to develop tools to make your process a lot more efficient. And so that includes like understanding which equipment providers are actually reliable. How much energy is your project going to generate based on like what it's forecasted to generate? How does it actually integrate with different types of facilities and their operations? All of those lessons learned are things that you integrate into your IP stack. It's kind of like an underrated type of company because we need more of them in the space to deploy the climate technologies necessary to meet the climate targets.
Okay, and so right now then, so as you explained, you're heading towards your seed financing round. You're kind of getting this first swathe of your projects ready to present at that. I'm kind of interested in your relationship with the Greentown Labs community. Like, how do they help you in that? I guess some people listening will definitely know a lot about Greentown Labs, but some may not. So what's been the benefit to you, given that kind of plan of being part of Greentown Labs community there in Houston?
Being at Greentown Labs, I think the best value that I've come out of it with is just the organic interactions that I've had being in the community, right? So talking to people in the co-working space, other member companies, the events that happen around the space, and maybe something that I didn't hear about, a colleague in the co-working space will tell me about, or the staff will invite us to, and kind of help us get integrated within the broader Houston energy transition community. That's been a tremendous benefit, and it's a very new incubator and space, right? It's only been around for almost a year. I think the 1-year anniversary is next month, and so it feels like being here in Houston at this time where you have a lot of these like traditional energy players starting to transition to cleaner resources or newer resources in the energy space. Like they need the know-how and understanding like the different solutions that are out there, and being here, having experience on more of the energy tech side, it's a good place to start to provide some of that knowledge and know-how to folks learning, as well as like grow the community here. And so being here on the ground floor of that is pretty exciting.
Well, we're looking forward to it. What date is it today? 21st of March today. And Mihir and I will be meeting each other next week at our event. And part of that is actually to go and visit a couple of disruptor facilities, but also Greentown Labs itself, to hear about the work they're doing with partly their Carbon to Value cohort, but also the wider community that you're a part of. So it'll be great to see you there. And thank you so much for joining us today. It's really interesting hearing about just this slightly earlier stage than often perhaps we do feature on the podcast, but it just feels like such an interesting point in time for you. And maybe we can get you back after the seed capital round so that we can talk about the scaling plans and what's going to come next.
Thank you so much, Alex.
Great to have you. Many thanks for listening to the Decarb Connect podcast. We work with clients across the industrial sectors, specifically those who are tasked with decarbonising the most energy-intensive products and materials that we use every day. If you have an interest in learning more about either our members network, our reports, or our event series, do get in touch with us at decarbconnect.com. Or if you'd like to take part in the podcast, email me, alex@ac@decarbconnect.com. Thanks for listening.